Hello, I'm Peter Tufano, the Dean of the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. Welcome to the latest in a series of events and conversations called Leadership in Extraordinary Times. The series has two elements: hearing from world-leading academics who can help us understand what's going on, how to deal with this set of health, economic, and humanitarian crises. And we also hear from leaders at the front, women and men in positions of leadership during these extraordinary times. As if a pandemic wasn't enough, with an economic crisis, we find ourselves in parts of the world, especially in America, with far worse. And I want to just offer a comment on the themes of leadership and justice. We're talking all about, today, the role of business in society. And a big part of that role of business is to worry about stakeholders. And as we're called to worry about stakeholders, we have to worry about how we administer fairness among those stakeholders to make trade-offs between them. And we become in business, arbiters of fairness. And the administration of fairness is justice, because that's the definition of the term. And as American, leader Martin Luther King has reminded us, injustice everywhere is a threat to justice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So while we're focused on the pandemic, while we're focused on the economic crisis, while we're focused on the civil liberties issues and others that are raised, today we stand in solidarity with those who faced ongoing systemic discrimination, and our hearts are with them today. Well, we'll be talking about this issue, I'm sure, in times to come, but on this particular day, I want to at least start by acknowledging that these are even more extraordinary times than usual. Back to COVID-19, as if that wasn't enough. COVID-19 is clearly a public health crisis, but it's also a deeper crisis in the way that business and economies work. How does the global healthcare system work, and what's the role of global healthcare companies? What's the responsibility of business? And in crisis, how should countries collaborate? Today, we travel to Switzerland to hear from Andre Hoffmann, Vice Chair of Roche. Roche was founded in 1896 in Basel by Andre's great-grandfather, Fritz Hoffmann-La-Roche, then 28 years old, a pioneering entrepreneur. During next year, the firm will celebrate its 125th anniversary, if my count is right. During these many years, it is aimed at targeting treatments for cancer, developing new personalized healthcare solutions, new diagnostic technologies, and recently, the first commercial diagnostic test for COVID-19. Andre speaks with authority about the Roche business as its vice chair, and also the family leader of the firm founded by his great-grandfather. He's an active leader among owners of large global family firms, working with the World Economic Forum, as well as sitting on the Family Advisory Council of the Ownership Project at Oxford, which my colleague who joins me today, Mary Johnstone-Louis, directs. This project aims at understanding and improving the role of responsible owners. Andre also contributes to our teaching of family business in the Oxford program on responsible ownership. Andre is not only active in Roche and in family business circles, but he's recognized as one of the world's leaders in the field of corporate sustainability. He's been a tireless advocate of conservation and biodiversity, working with the World Wildlife Foundation, which was founded by his father, and many other organizations. His tweet on his birthday this weekend was emblematic of his approach. To quote him, "We cannot sustain life or do business on a dead planet." Andre is also a firm supporter of business education. Beyond his engagement at Oxford, both on the Ownership Project and the funding of the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann scholarships, he has set up the Hoffmann Global Institute for Business and Society at his alma mater, INSEAD. A word about format. As with our other Leading Extraordinary Times guests, Mary and I will interview Andre for about 35 minutes and then open the floor up to you and your questions. So please do send them in. With no further delays, let's get on with Andre Hoffmann. Andre, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to follow up this elogious presentation, but I'll try my best.
I'm sure you'll do far better. So, Andre, maybe we can start with the Roche business. Not all of our viewers will understand Roche's purpose statement, doing what patients need next, or the role that the firm has played in battling COVID. Could you begin by giving them some context for the firm's work and how it's approached the role in addressing this global health issue?
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much, Marie, for organizing all this. I think it's important that we sort of define what a business is and what the purpose of a business is. Mm-hmm. We exist since 125 years, as you mentioned, next year. We've been taking very seriously this notion of being in business for life. Our aim, our purpose is the patient. And that's something we've taken very seriously since the beginning of this COVID crisis, but also, of course, for the 123 years that we had before that. The purpose of a company is what drives its activities and is what drives its impact on the system around it. The idea of being in business just to make money is an idea that I think has served its purpose, but is no longer relevant. Today, if you want to be an enduring company, you need to be able to think long term. Now, long term does not just only mean finding a niche that you can occupy forever, because nothing like this really exists, but it is an opportunity to repurpose your business on a specific target on an ongoing basis. Our business is the health of our patient, and therefore a pandemic like the one we're living at the moment is an opportunity for us to deploy our intellectual and financial capacity to be able to service that crisis, and that's what we've been trying to do. For those of you who are following the pharmaceutical market, our company is not involved in vaccines. This is a business we don't really practice and therefore do not have any particular competence in. But we are very active in testing. We are the largest in vitro diagnostic company in the world. And we also have done over the years quite a lot of work on antiviral drugs, in particular during the HIV epidemic some years ago. But before we go into what's the notion of what Roche has done in particular, I'd like to just make a general comment. We, the humans, have been 10,000 years on this planet. We've been trying to take an awful lot of time creating systems and ways of exchanging with nature, which have allowed us to take over the dominant role. Today, some very serious people talk about the current age as being the Anthropocene, in other words, the age where humanity runs the planet. So we consider ourselves as the most sophisticated system the world has ever seen, and we manage and live according to this. And then suddenly, one of the most primitive organisms on the planet, a virus, which is just a little strand of RNA with 5 genes, not as much as 5 genes, comes and our whole civilization collapses. We've been closed down for 3 months because of a very predictable problem, which has suddenly hit us very hard. Now, when I say predictable, we had a couple of attempts at pandemics before, which luckily, for biological reasons, did not persevere. But the one we are living at the moment is something that has succeeded in jumping zoonosis, jumping from animals to humans, and developing really quickly in our very open society. We've created an avenue for that virus, and that virus has taken a chance of it. Has taken this as an opportunity. Now, I don't want this to be interpreted as me saying that we should be a segmented society. Certainly not, and we can come back to that later. But what's important is to realize that the zoonosis on that scale can only be possible because of the model of development that we humans have chosen. We have, over the last generations, focused much more on short-term satisfaction, short-term efficacy, short-term efficiency, perhaps even short-term profit optimization, compared to the long-term, which is really the base of a resilient system. Today, we get to the point where we have compromised the long-term for the short-term. And to come back to your question about Roche, I think that's the fact that we have been in existence for 125 years, and that the fact that we've been able to go for a couple of health crises successfully demonstrate that we are, on an ongoing basis, trying to take decisions which take into account this trade-off between long-term and short-term. You cannot really create resilience, you cannot really create a system that is stable if you only look at the short-term future. And in corporations, in businesses, that means short-term profit maximization. So, you cannot only use financial as a way of measuring success. But I hope we will be able to come back to that later.
Great. Let's take on the short-term versus long-term. So when COVID hit, I'm sure this was not the agenda that you thought you were going to be facing in the first couple of quarters of 2020. and you had to, I'm sure, pivot the firm somehow and make some decisions where there were some trade-offs involved, probably that had short-term consequences. How did you think about, moving in order to combat using your tests? And then what trade-offs did you face, and how did you deal with that as an organization?
Well, we have to look a bit at the calendar. End of last year, January this year, suddenly these noises come from China. There is a disease there which is growing quickly. The Chinese government very quickly, with the help of the local CDC, by the way, run by an Oxford graduate, so quite close to what it is you are doing, publishes the genetic code of the virus and describes it properly. Our scientists get to work and identify a PCR test that is a viral test which will identify the presence of the virus in the body. It took us 2 months to prepare this, and it has been on sale since mid-March. We operate mostly with robots which are in place in big hospitals, so we have a high throughput capacity. We can run a lot of these tests once the reagent that is needed for that test is identified. So this comes to the market in mid-March, and it starts being produced. You have to realize that this is based on a technology called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and that PCR technology is practiced by every biotech company on the planet. It's the base of biotech, of the modern biotechnology. You take a little strand, a very small fraction of DNA. With this technology, you multiply it to the point where you can actually use it to be tested. So you have enough quantity for doing that. So there is an awful lot of what we call in the business home brews. I mean, people who can do that at home. And a lot of the tests that were done at the beginning were done on a sort of ad hoc basis. I mean, they were perfectly able to determine the viral load, but our test works on robots, like a couple of other companies, and that allows us to I was going to say industrialize it, but I mean automate it and relieve the pressure on hospitals on lab hospitals. Now, the next step of this was, of course, there you identify somebody who has the virus, but you don't really measure the antibodies presence in the body. And we decided, we started from the beginning onwards to try to measure a test which will give us the level of antibodies in the body. And we have now developed a blood-based test, a serology test, serum-based test, which provides us with a reading of if there are antibodies present in the body or not. And this test has to look at two aspects. It has to look at the specificity. Is it the real virus we're testing? And is it also accurate into measuring the load? And I'm glad to say that our test, which was introduced 4 weeks ago, measures 100% of the right antibody and 99.8% of the specificity of the antibody. So we are, and this is one of the reasons why we're not among the first, but we are at the moment among the most precise tests on the market. Not only that, but because they're automated, we can produce up to 100 million of these tests a month, and we are ramping up capacity to be able to do more than that. Now, 100 million a month for 7 billion inhabitants is a little bit small, but again, we can come back to that later. So on the front of testing, I think we have a portfolio which allows us to answer most of the questions that humanity is facing. The WHO has recommended that what you should be doing with these tests is to identify, isolate, treat, and separate the communities who have these tests. So we need to be able to test them in great quantities in order to be able to identify where the disease is. Now, we would like to restart the economy, and that's again something we can discuss separately, but we want to restart the economy. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we release in the field only people who are less at risk than others. And this test would allow us to measure that. There's one big question mark, which has not been answered yet, is how long do you have immunity after having been infected? It's a bit early to say. The disease has only been described since the beginning of the year. So it will take a while before we know if this immunity is something that will hold. But I think that given the history of other coronaviruses, I think that's quite likely that we would have at least a year, if not two, of immunity.
Yeah. So Andre, you had said that you had this tremendous testing capability of 100 million tests in a world that needed 7 billion. and actually more than 7 billion, because many of us are going to have to be tested on a weekly or kind of semi-weekly basis. And as we know, at the beginning of this, the UK said that they were going to have 100,000 tests a day, and they had trouble getting up to that. And the US said even more. And there was a lot of competition for testing. How do you as a firm think about where you direct your tests, or given that supply that you have, that precious supply that you have, in a world of nationalization of testing or nationalization of cures? How do you think about that as a firm based in Switzerland? But still,
that immediately becomes the nexus. How do we make sure that the people who need it get it at the right time? In an ideally working system, the WHO should be able to give us some indication how to do that. And we have been in frequent contact with them. We're in partnership with government, with health systems, and with the WHO. And we have created systems which allow us to allocate these resources to the best possible one. But to the best possible users, sorry. Because as I said before, these are run on robots, and these robots need to be present. If I sell, I don't know, a test to a country which doesn't have the robot, then the test will just sit in a warehouse doing nothing. And that's, of course, nobody's interest. So there has to be an understanding of what the marketplace is. And at the same time, there also has to be an understanding of who needs it most. And at the moment, we have been left on a number of occasions to make our own decisions. And in a system which, as a non-executive, in a system that I would like to see is a system where society would be sufficiently organized to be able to allocate these tests on the right basis rather than just having doing it ourselves. Now, why do we have to do it? Because governments, and that's a second crisis we're living. We're not only living a crisis of diseases, we're also living a political crisis where the borders have shut and where people defend their own interest. And people are very willing to hold these tests without having people who need them as much as they do use them. And that strikes me as being a real issue which can only be settled by international corporations. We are in this together. The virus doesn't know any borders. The idea that a certain country will have more tests than others is quite a worrying fact, because we know that means that when the vaccine will come, and the vaccine will eventually come, the same principles are going to apply. Some people are going to be more equal than others, and that's something we need to fight. As a test manufacturers, we are in daily conversation on this. I imagine that the dozen of companies currently experimenting with vaccines will have the same sort of conversation, so we should learn from this.
But I suppose what you're saying is that we have to ask governments in order to address those issues, and actually supranational organizations to do even more. Good.
Well, you very rightly started this conversation by talking about the problems, and in particular the problems in the US at the moment. The COVID lens, if I can call it that way, has exacerbated weaknesses that were in our system long before the virus came. Now, racial differentiation and inequalities in the US is not something new. But the concentration of sun rays through the lens to this dry wood has created the combustion we're seeing now, and the same thing might happen again if we don't learn from this.
Yes. Why don't we pivot a little bit and talk about environmental issues, and maybe over to Mary for this next segment.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks so much, Andre, for joining us. So again, as Peter mentioned, there's another global issue that you've been very passionate about, and your family actually has been very dedicated to, which is the protection of nature and biodiversity loss, and looking at issues around climate. Can you tell us about your journey to having a sense of passion and commitment for those particular issues? And then tell us how that links to another point of passion for you, which is business as a force for good.
Well, first of all, the word passionate includes a sort of word, it worries me slightly as a use, because I'm passionate for a work of art, or I'm passionate for, I don't know, something, but protecting nature is not a question of passion, it's a question of absolute necessity. Nature is our life support system on Earth. If nature becomes dysfunctional, well, you get exactly what we have now. The reason we are invaded by a virus is because we haven't looked after nature in the proper manner. The distanciation, the respect, the trust, and perhaps also the relationship of humility with nature has disappeared. We're convinced that we are more important than nature, and that allows a couple of gates or a couple of windows in which things can invade. So as the WHO, the European Union, and a couple of other bodies have said, this is a man-made epidemic, and we should not hide ourselves from that. So the reason my family, my father before me, and all the rest have a supported nature is not because we believe that it is a beautiful thing to have, which it is, by the way, that animals are lovely and that forests are wonderful places where resource themselves. It's because it is indispensable to human life. Human life will not survive long in a dysfunctional nature. And I don't want to sound sort of righteous, and I don't want to sound like if nature is taking revenge or something stupid like this. It's just that we need to find a balance, an equilibrium, and if you want to have resilient society, nature needs to function properly. So the rebuild we're going to do after this virus will need to introduce a couple of nature-based solutions. And the WHO has mentioned that beautifully a couple of days ago in its latest statement. The European Union and its Green Deal is talking about this. We see more and more this notion that it is better to cooperate rather than dominate. I spent quite a lot of time in my life until now protecting wetlands. Wetlands are. I grew up in wetlands. I grew up in the south of France, in the Camargue. Wetlands are smelly. They're unproductive according to our definition of productivity, but they do play an important role into the water cycle, in particular in terms of climate change. In times of climate change, they purify water. I mean, traditionally in the Mediterranean, I know a couple of examples like this. You go to a wetlands, you dry it. You grow rice for a couple of years, and then the land productivity declines, and you replace the capacity of this wetland by creating a recycling factory on the next door, which is going to recycle the water, a treatment plant, which is going to be expensive and needs maintenance and is less efficient than a perfectly healthy wetland. So I think there's a lot to be done in that direction, and I'm glad to say that that particular message is coming through. So it's not passion, it's reason. And I think it's important to say. But it doesn't mean that you cannot be passionately reasonable, of course.
And that's very helpful. And if you could link that in terms of your own commitment to the concept of business as a force for good, what does that concept mean to you? And how does nature play into that?
So coming back in this notion of wanting to protect nature, our family foundation, which exists since more than 30 years, has spent a lot of time identifying protected areas, areas which need to be protected. We've also done quite a lot of work in biodiversity, trying to protect species which need to be protected. And then you have to ask yourself the question, well, we came here and we did that protection plan for that particular area. We created some measures to make sure that this particular species does not disappear. How come that year after year, we have to come back to do something about it? How come that the pressure on natural resources and the pressure on natural habitats is not declining? And so we started thinking, what is it that is this engine which constantly drives us forward to try to use nature in a more systematic manner? And the answer has to be business. The way we practice business is short-term profit maximization. It's the Milton Friedman doctrine of the Chicago School of Economics of the late 70s. The business of business is business. Now, when I say that, it's not criticism, it's just analysis. Yeah, we've been taught at business school, and I went to business school as well, of course. We've been taught at business school that the function of a company is to produce wealth, is to produce value, and that value is then paid back to society for taxes, for salaries, for livelihoods, for dividends, for share prices. And all this is then used by societies to deal with the externalities that were, or if you want, were the collateral damages that were created in the value creation business. In other words, let me make money and then you deal with the consequences. You being the company, you deal with the consequences. And that, I'm afraid, is simply absurd. It doesn't matter how you spend the money. It's how you make it that matters. If you can create a sustainable long-term thinking model, which will distribute wealth to employees, stakeholders, and societies in which we operate, we don't need to go for this compensation mechanism. So for me, business as a force for good is when we identify businesses who can have an impact on society, which is which is net positive. We should bring to the system more than we take out. And that's a key for a long-term sustainable future, sustainable existence. And it's also a way of making sure that society will support us, because in many ways, businesses have had a crisis of confidence, of trust. People tend to not support businesses because they've seen us in the past behaving according to this mantra. And a lot of people are starting to realize that what's important is not just the owner, but also the stakeholders. And I think that brings us into a different sort of conversation. And that's what I mean when I talk about business as a force for good. We need to ensure that the new leadership will do something for the system rather than just for the company.
Thank you, Andre. And that's the perspective you bring as a contributor to our program on responsible ownership, which we have, has a specific focus on family companies. So I wanted you to just speak for a moment about, as an owner, what does responsible ownership mean to you? And more specifically, how do we move from rhetoric to action on responsible ownership, speaking as an owner yourself?
Well, I have the weakness to believe that businesses which are owned by long-term thinking owners, and with that I mean probably families, although it could be also some reference holder, have a different perspective on reality. In our business, we are very lucky to be a sort of hybrid business. We are quoted on a stock exchange, and we have a number of people who hold our papers. And on the other hand, you have a family which has long-term control. And so for us, we need to navigate this trade-off we were speaking about earlier on. We need to make sure that we satisfy short-term interests without compromising the long-term. We as owners think in a transgenerational manner. What we really want to make sure is that in the next generation, 20, 30, 40 years ago from now, and I hope to live for a very long time, so the later the better, we will be able to give the next generation an opportunity to behave as owners in a responsible manner. Now, what that means is that you need to use resources and strengths and talents and individuality within the company towards serving the purpose of the company and not just towards satisfying the shareholder. So we're not in this for an increase in dividend. We're in this for the long term and for serving the patient. And I cannot think of a better way of explaining that than this notion of putting a purpose in the middle. And in the health company like Roche, it's easy. It has to be the patient, because last year, more than 100 million people took our drugs. They were not all cured, but a lot of them were. And that's an intense satisfaction, which can be measured in a lot of different things, not necessarily in money. For me, we tend to measure the performance of companies, and in particular for owners, only based on financial levels. And there are other capitals we need to talk about as well. We need to talk about natural capital. What impact are we having on the environment? We need to talk about social capital. What does our action have as a consequence and on the social system in which we are active? We need to talk about human capital, talent. It's quite important to make sure that the talent you have joins you for the right reasons and stays for the right reason. And that, I'm afraid to say to all the employees of Roche, that doesn't mean increasing the salary every year. It's also a question of personal development, and I think we all understand that. And so we need to develop, and that's for business in general, not just for Roche, we need to develop a new metric which will allow us to measure success of a company, not just based on financial return, but also on impact, environmental and social.
That's very helpful. Peter, I'm going to pass over to you for...
Sure. So let's stick on that for a moment, Andre. So, am I to understand that your theory of change, because, you are an exemplar in this space. I mean, to be honest, this series has not really been a representative series. We started with Paul Pullman, who you know well. Paul is not the normal CEO. We had Hiro Mizuno, who's not the normal investment manager or kind of asset owner, and neither are you. You are an exemplar. So what's the theory of change to move other firms where you are? You just mentioned metrics. Is it about metrics? Is it about boards? Is it about consumers? Where are the levers in society to move more firms and more owners, managers, shareholders, everybody to think more like you? Where do you see the way that we move forward here?
Well, the COVID crisis is one of these crux moments. We have discovered that our systems are not resilient. As I was saying a couple of minutes ago, we've collapsed in front of adversity. And a system that is not able to weather adverse events is not a system fit for purpose. And so I think it is going to become more easy. It's going to become easier to explain the weakness of our system now than it was only 3 months ago. Now, when I say we should look at a nature-based solution for the rebuild, what I mean is that we really need to change. The most important trade-off is the one we were discussing before, the trade-off between long-term, short-term. You cannot go on just in short-term profit maximization if you want to run these large, incredibly impactful companies on the planet. We need to find a new metric. And you're right, Peter, to mention that. It strikes me that capital accounting on natural, social, human, and environmental and financial capital is important. And just because we need to be able to compare. Now, over the last couple of years, we've seen more and more of an emergence of this thinking that stakeholder matters, that companies should state their purpose. So we are broadening the field, but there's still some work to be done there. And I think that's where we can have the biggest influence. The financial industry, and particularly the investment industry, is where a lot of this will happen. When you are managing somebody else's fund, you have a fiduciary duty to maximize that particular value. As long as we collectively do not recognize that maximizing value means long-term value creation, it's going to be difficult for financial professionals. But there again, I feel reasonably hopeful that there are new ideas coming forward. And you see that with your students at Saïd. I see that with the students at INSEAD, and in particular in the work we do with the Global Institute for Business and Society. I mean, there is a realization among the younger generation that just making money is not going to be enough. Mm-hmm. Because you are not going to be able to mobilize these funds in a useful manner going forward. And I wish I could give you an immediate example. I mean, we were talking about nature-based solution, the restoration of mangroves outside of Miami, for instance. Miami was disappearing in the water, and now that the local university has pushed the restoration of mangrove, there is a system which allows a better flood movement control, and that could be an example. But there are a number of others, of course.
So the beginning of your answer, you said that COVID, this crisis that we've experienced, it kind of convinces us all that the world is broken. But there's two reactions to that. One is the hopeful reaction that you've outlined, but we also see and we don't have to look at too far in the news to understand how political forces can use the same crisis for less positive outcomes. How do we make sure that this doesn't tip us into a more negative place? As opposed to a more positive place?
So one of the toolbox that we have given ourselves to manage the future is the Sustainability Development Goals, the United Nations negotiation in between business, NGOs, and the United Nations for the Agenda 2030 for where we want to take the planet collectively. And SDG number 1 is ending poverty. And of course, that particular crisis has created more poverty and will create more poverty. So the idea of this knee-jerk reaction and saying it is now absolutely crucial that we liberate business to just go on creating value because we need that value, and that's worked very well in the previous cycle. The Millennium Goals did raise about 800 million people out of poverty. So it's just collateral damages that we want to manage now at the same time as we manage the value creation. So we need to be very careful and mindful of this. There is the traditional opportunity would be to say, well, now let's get business go loose, entrepreneurial forces unleash themselves, and they will create the value we need. But we know that that is at the cost of the environment, which we can probably not keep under control. The Paris Agreement did not happen just because people wanted it. It happened because there was a realization that we are eroding the well-being on Earth at a rate higher than what we can restore it. So I saw with great interest that the European Union has created this Green New Deal, where it starts by saying 50% of the value of business is predicated on nature. I would argue 100% is, because if you don't have the system around you, you would probably not be able to do any of the things we are doing in that context. So we are going to need to stand firm on that particular ground. And the great tool we have, and it pains me to say that as an advocate for business as a force for good, the great tools we have is that a lot of the decisions which are going to be taken in the next half a decade is going to be in the hands of governments, because governments have stepped up and refinanced the economy on a massive scale. The true owners of the value creation business now are no longer businesses for a couple of years until they can earn themselves out of this. It's regulators, it's international organizations, it's the IMF, it's governments, etc. And there is a mechanism that we should be really using, and that is this conditionality issue. Yeah? I give you an example. The Swiss government has decided to bail out Swiss, the airline company, has provided 1.8 billion Swiss francs, which of course globally is of no significance, but for Swiss, life or death, and has put up a conditionality saying we want you to emit less CO2. This was then sent to the Parliament, who removed the conditionality, who said, no, we want Swiss to continue to produce jobs. And it's 15,000 jobs. It's not negligible. But as long as we don't have the political courage to take this opportunity to really be serious about implementing measures which are going to help us to go towards the achievement of the Paris Agreement, as long as we are not really taking climate into account with this conditionality, we are missing an opportunity. And I think it should be the role of every leader here around us to do this. The fact that so many health systems were unprepared for this pandemic, despite the repeated warnings, is a crisis of leadership. So now it's time for leadership to emerge and to do something about how we're going to recreate all this.
So what are the positive examples of leadership you're seeing right now? Because you've said that, well, you use the term we a lot, which is great. We are all on this together, and in fact, it is about we, not about I. And you've talked about business and government and regulators and international organizations. And so as you look across the world right now, where do you see the positive examples of leadership that our young people could look to as examples?
So as I said just before, I think we need to pivot away from just business leadership, where we have some outstanding thinkers. You were mentioning Paul Polman before. There are a couple of other of his successors in different activities, but they are now a little bit on the back foot. So we need to go towards governments. And there in Europe, I must say that I find Mrs. Merkel quite remarkable. She has made a couple of pronouncements which are really absolutely appropriate. It's the fourth time I quote it, but the Green New Deal is something which is exactly hitting at the we're getting to huge amount of unemployment. We're going to need to create new jobs in building up the green infrastructure. Fitting houses with solar captors, insulation. I mean, all the jobs you need for infrastructure are going to provide those in the short term, a little bit in the spirit of a Marshall Plan or a reconstruction plan. So I see leadership in some of the politicians. I'm afraid I see very poor leadership in other politicians, but I don't think we want to start on this because that would take us very far. In terms of refinancing what is in front of us, we need decisive action, and I think the idea of furloughing the most staff, etc., was a way of maintaining credibility in the system. But the real challenge is coming.
Mm-hmm. Great. Maybe over to Mary for a few questions.
Yeah, so as we think about the world that our MBA students are going into right now, the ones who are currently leaving this cohort, and also students who are thinking about a business education right now, what advice would you give to MBA students, Andre, who want to turn their degree into a positive impact?
So first of all, leadership. We need leaders who are going to make a difference to this planet. And working in industry and business in general would have been, sorry, I don't want to be laying that point too thickly, but we need people who are going to run companies not based just on financial returns, but on the measurements of the different capitals. We need people taking decisions based on net contribution to society. It is perfectly normal that a pharmaceutical business should concentrate on its carbon footprint or should concentrate onto the quality of the water it restitutes to the system. It's not part of your mission, but it is part of your being as a company. You cannot be a business if you're not a net contributor. In the past, we could have said something along the lines of, oh, well, it doesn't matter if you make no impact. It doesn't matter as long as you do no evil. But today that's over. We need to contribute because the situation has gone a little bit too far. We need to be net contributors. So we need new leadership with a holistic approach to what the value creation business is in business. Now, we also need to realize that the solution will not come from business alone, but it will be a public-private partnership. Governments on their own will never succeed in reconstructing the mess in front of us. We need entrepreneurial drive, entrepreneurial existence, entrepreneurial motivations to change something. So we need to develop this new partnership between business regulators and businesses. And it has to be based on a mutual understanding of what is good for the system. So business as a force for good becomes society as a force for good. We need together to do something. So I would suggest that if I was talking to an MBA candidate, to make sure that they understand what the regulators do and how they work and what they represent, and not just concentrate onto the startup mentality of disruption and we need to rebuild now. And if you want to rebuild, you're going to have to change, to be a little bit more conciliatory. I don't know if that corresponds to the message that Saïd wants to give to its students, but I would definitely try to reach a new agreement there. Maybe a new social contract, to put it bluntly.
I think that's a message that both Saïd and INSEAD students could bear hearing a lot more of. Andre, let's go to the audience. We have a number of questions. We have people in Afghanistan, Ireland, Bolivia, UK, India, Bangladesh, Iran, Peru, US, Malaysia, and more. So let me, and Mary, feel free to read this list too, and you can pull off a few as well. Maybe a question from Kurt from the UK. What do you think about continuing to manufacture in China?
Well, globalization has helped greatly to the execution of the Millennium Goals we were discussing before. We have been able to provide a better supporting system to what we do because of opening up the borders. I think that the idea of throwing the baby away with the bathwater, is not a good idea. For instance, our tests are, parts of them are manufactured in China, part of them are manufactured in Germany. The machines which run the tests are manufactured in Switzerland. The day when the government just say we're going to close the curtain and we don't let everything go is going to be something that will bring to a serious problem on the system as it's old. So my answer to that question would be yes, we will continue to manufacture in China if we can get assurance from the system that we are free to import or export what it is we need. A well-known country which is in the moment in social difficulties told us that we were not allowed to export things from one of the states because it was needed for the nation itself. That's a logic or a way of being that we cannot tolerate.
Right.
I mean, tolerate sounds a bit violent. I don't want to be violent. It's something that is not helpful.
Fine. Well, as we know, that one of the more interesting exchanges at Davos was around taxation, and a question that we get from the audience today is on taxation from actually one of our colleagues. just read it. A few days ago, Paul Pullman wrote, corporations must stop the usual tax avoidance and start paying more tax in order to be resilient and responsible. What are the duties of large family businesses like yours when it comes to corporate tax?
So maybe I will reply first to general and to the particular. In general, I think family businesses, and we didn't really have time to talk about this before, are for me a bit like a Trojan horse. By behaving in a way which is a bit more human-centric rather than just business-centric, we can, in the long term, demonstrate to the rest of our of business how managing for values and managing for purpose can make a difference. And it's easier for family businesses because we have a long-term perspective by definition. Now, if we bring that back to taxes, it means, yes, you have a reasonable amount of tax that you have to pay. And if the city doesn't like the amount of tax we're paying, well, then they'll have to change the way they measure this. We are at Roche, we are not ashamed of showing our rate of tax. For years, and again, when I did my MBA at INSEAD, I was told that tax optimization is a management skill. I think today that has gone very far. Some of these tax agreement that governments are doing to attract big businesses into their geography are at the verge of being reasonable, and this is going to be revisited. So I would reply to your colleague that yes, there is probably a natural rate of tax. We just need to make sure that that tax is used in a proper manner, and we need to make sure that it doesn't disappear into a bottomless pit. And so that creates a certain duty to perform to the government who are perceiving these taxes. So we are quite willing to be transparent and to pay our fair share to the system of money flows, but then the people who are receiving these monies need to be equally transparent and to demonstrate to us that they're using this money in the most efficient manner. That's not a threat; it's just a statement.
Yep. So let me a question from Pat, which I'll kind of personalize. Pat from Hong Kong asked, what's your advice for boards who are supposed to be thinking big picture for companies? How can they embed ESG and purpose in their transformation? I'm going to be sitting on a board meeting for about 16 hours in the next 2 days. What advice would you give to board members who are trying to push these agendas forward? How do you be more effective in the boardroom on this set of agendas?
Well, I mean, that's a completely it's a holistic approach. ESG is not something you do on top of what you do. You run the business according to the purpose we've talked about several times here, and you do it in a way which is a net contribution to society. So you don't have an ESG metric which satisfies the investor. You act in such a way. So you need to make sure that this notion of sustainability, this notion of long-term thinking, this notion of proper use of natural resources, perhaps even of a certain circular use of resources, is embedded into the business activity. No point in no point to create value and then try to repair. The point is you need to create that value in a way which integrates all this. So when you take a next decision for building a factory, don't just look at the net present value, look at also at the impact it is having on the local society and what impact it is having on the environment around the plant. It's a way of thinking rather than a way of measuring. What we need are investment tools and not just measurements, because we are dependent on the things we are doing around us. And I think I think dependency is the key word. That's what I would use. When you go into a conversation about the future of the business, try to measure how dependent are you on the system in which we are working.
Thanks, Andre. I have a question from Peter, who is the treasurer of the Oxford PPE Society here, and he wants to ask, what role do pharmaceutical companies, including Roche, including your colleagues, play in increasing affordability and delivery of medical treatments? So with this, he's talking about not only the delivery of medicine, but also healthcare, particularly in the developing world.
So that conversation about healthcare, we'll have to start from scratch again. I mean, we've had such panic reaction during the pandemic, and still now. There's going to be a lot of time devoted to this in the in the foreseeable future. In the meantime, I can talk about the pricing. What is pricing in a healthcare environment? The idea that you price like in any other products cost plus is completely hidden by the fact that you have these huge investments into research, and this is a system society has given itself to come up with innovation in health. Innovation in health is you are able to get the patent life to recover some of the investments you've made into developing a new drug. And I think that's an important thing. I'll give you an example. Our tests, we have discovered, developed a completely innovative test in serology for COVID with 100% accuracy and 99.8% specificity. That test will not be priced at higher than what it costs us. It will be a reasonable price in line with what we have in other tests. So it will not be because the world needs it and because we have because we hold the knife by the handle and not by the blade is not a reason for price gouging. And as long as we can get these principles well established among the pharmaceutical industry, pricing should be sufficiently transparent to be able to continue. And I have a couple of other examples of this. I mean, we can go on for quite a long time.
Great.
So affordability depends on a number of different things. You cannot have you should not just look at the price and at the need. You should look at the total system, the way it functions. By paying a certain amount of money for instance, a genetically engineering solution for some rare disease, you can keep the patient out of hospital for his or her whole life. So that has to be mirrored in the price of the drug.
And how about support for health infrastructure? The question also spoke about the need for health infrastructure.
Well, a business has to be profitable if it wants to be part of the solution. So if we are now burdened with looking after hospitals as well, I don't think we will be as profitable and therefore not able to innovate as much as we can. Our business as pharmaceutical is to serve the patient with innovation. As we said at the beginning, doing today what the patient needs next. And we could not do that if we have to participate to all sorts of other costs. But the future is based on collaboration, and collaboration means understanding the needs of hospitals and healthcare delivery to be able to find a solution at our level in pharmaceuticals, which will correspond to the maximization to the system.
Okay, we have a question also from the Associate Manager for Clinical Study in New York at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. So this is the question saying that you've talked about the need for leaders who are going to make a difference on this planet. What's your view of what makes a good leader in Roche? What do you look for?
Well, first of all, of course, this long-term, short-term conversation we've had enough, so I don't think I'll go back to that. I need to also have somebody who is able to motivate the 99,000 employees we have to get them to pull in the same direction for the benefit of the patients. So you do not motivate a sales team by giving them cash bonuses only. You give them you motivate them by making it clear for them who they are actually serving. We've done a satisfaction survey among our employees only 2 weeks ago. First of all, nearly 80% of them responded to the survey, which is our all-time high score. And one of the questions was, how do you feel towards your employer? And one of the options was, we are proud of Roche, and nearly more than 3/4 selected this. So I think that our leader is not a leader which, as in the good old days, sees the light and then runs and everybody follows. It's more a question of creating business as an impresario, as a sort of devolved leadership. We do not make Roche, we co-create it together. And every single individual working for Roche is there for the patient and is there for helping the company to deliver to the patient. I'll give you an example. For these tests, we were short of staff because, of course, people were staying at home by fear of contamination. And so some of the clerical staff, some of the people in the administration went down in the factory to be able to help. Now, we would never have asked for it. You know, just not possible. But because people have this sort of feeling of ownership, feeling of we are part of the solution, it seemed quite natural to do it. I mean, I reassure you, they were not mixing, they were just boxing, but still.
Thanks, Andre. Over to you, Peter.
Great. A question from Chandrika. Sorry if I mispronounced your name on Facebook. And this is going back to the broader issues about business and society and nature. I think the challenge is countries with big populations like India and China. Will they also consider the importance of nature and the environment? During the lockdown, we've seen several policy measures which have been contrary to respect for the environment. How will the global community help change those kinds of narratives?
Well, first, I would say that maybe just a word on China. China exists as a country, as a continent, since 5,000 years, and they've been already at least twice into a situation of collapse, of the whole system disappearing because of environmental or social pressure. So there is there, in my experience, a bigger respect of the social balances than I've seen in other places. You've been to Beijing. The plain around Beijing is known nowadays as lowest plateau. This was a place where there was an overexploitation in agricultural terms for 500 years, and the whole dynasty, and forgive me if I don't remember the name of the dynasty, collapsed because they were short of food. And so this notion is quite impregnated in the Chinese psyche, that there is a limit to well-being brought about by the environment. When we as WWF 30 years ago tried to reintroduce the panda into its area, we found a very propitious listening administration to this sort of thing. And there is a relationship, a respect to nature in China, which is not obvious because of the amount of people that are there and what they are actually doing as the environment. On the environment, but there is a willingness to learn there. So that would be just a challenge. Now, in general, how do we make sure that people realize nature and the impact of nature? I think the fact that the Paris Agreement was signed is already a sign that a lot of administration are taking this more seriously than they ever have before. At the moment, it's just a declaration of intention, but there are more and more movements at national levels who are pushing for a change in this. Here in Switzerland, the last election has brought a lot of green deputies to the parliament. I've seen that happening in a number of other European countries. I think that there is an anxiety towards the future, and anxiety towards this notion that we are perhaps over-consuming natural resources, and that is something that should be addressed. So how do we change? Through evidence.
So, Andre, we're nearing the end of the hour. A question we'd like to ask at the very end is, rather than, sometimes people use the expression build back better. I would argue you can't build back, you have to build forward better. So what are your hopes for the world? Let's say in 3 to 5 years. I mean, I know you've talked about the long-term path that you hope that we're on, but what concrete things do you hope that we'll see in 3 to 5 years that will demonstrate that we're on this better path?
But to a certain extent, we've touched on that several times during this conversation. Building back, absolutely not. There's no need. There's no opportunity to rebuild a system that was in failure before. We need to make sure that we do the same thing as we were starting to do before the crisis, but that we do them quicker and faster. I mean, the 2030 agenda of the United Nations seems to me to be a good baseline. I would expect us today to be able to get there before 2030, and that we shall then go to a net zero carbon economy rather quickly after that. But climate is just one thing. The real issue is the destruction of life, the destruction of biodiversity. Carbon emission in the atmosphere is something that we can measure. We can do something about it. We will be successful or not, I don't know, but we will try our best. Once you've lost a species, it's gone forever. Nobody comes back from death. Its extinction is forever. And so once these species have disappeared, I suppose we could play the Jurassic Park thing, but somehow, I don't really believe that we will do that. And so it's important to continue to preserve diversity, because in diversity there is richness, and in diversity there is also a certain amount of safety. Today, we would not have this crisis if we had a more diverse system. It's because we are a human monoculture that we have given this development opportunity to the COVID. And I think to COVID-19, to the SARS-2, to the coronavirus. And it's very important that we should make sure that this does not happen again. So I would like to see a system that is more resilient, and I think resilient has to be the end word of this conversation. We are lacking resilience, and we need to create it. And we will only do that if we are more diverse.
So I think that is a great end for us. We all need to be more resilient individually, organizationally, and as a planet. Andre, I can't think of anybody who's tried to push these ideas more powerfully or more eloquently than you have, within so many different venues, within Roche, within the World Economic Forum community, within the business community, within the nature community, and pushing us in business education. And while there's some friendly competition between INSEAD and Oxford, the truth is that we're all trying to get the same thing done. And you've been a force for good in all those places. And you know, on behalf of Mary and I and this audience, I want to thank you not only for being here today, but for your leadership and for the example of leadership that you've shown. So thank you so much. And we'll leave with the final word of resilience, because that seems like a pretty good place to end.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you.
Pleasure. Yeah. For those of you out there, please join us on Thursday for the next edition of Leadership in Extraordinary Times, when our colleague, Andrew Baum, will chair a panel on post-COVID-19 scenarios for the real estate industry. How has the crisis hit markets and businesses? What are the most affected landlords and tenants? Are there long-term changes in the sector? He'll be joined by a great panel of experts. And again, thank you for joining us today. And a close with the word justice. And I hope that that's on our minds forever. Thank you so much. Andre?
I'll be there. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.